Hello, fellow suffering students. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at an economics IB course 1.2 demand, standard level, and high level. So let's get started. And I'll go ahead and list the timeframes and I talk about each of these subtopics for easier studying after. Okay, so if you watched my previous video and talking about the Introduction to Economics 1.1, you'll know that I distinguished micro and macroeconomics. Okay, so now we're going to be starting the syllabus with microeconomics and individual markets, which we'll talk about more in more detail later on. But in relation to demand specifically, in the next few chapters, you will be looking at the way in which consumers and producers interact with one another and with each other. Now, if you guys did listen to me explain the introduction to economics, you'll remember these terms consumers and producers, which are basically just two examples of stakeholders that are most commonly found in microeconomics. But obviously, no demand, nor supply, nor any economic transactions can take place in the first place unless there is a place for them to be had. Hence, we have the word markets. Now, you've probably heard me use this as a general term before if you did watch the 1.1 video, but essentially a market is where buyers and sellers come together to carry out an economic transaction. And we are being very unspecific by saying the term economic transaction on purpose, just so that it can refer to literally anything that we will learn throughout this entire course. But just to be clear, as a quick little reminder, buyers would be consumers, whereas sellers would be something called producers. Okay, so that should be really straightforward. Consumers consume product, producers produce product. Okay, that should be very straightforward at this point. Now, there's different types of markets, so let's go ahead and define that a little bit further. Markets may be physical places where goods and services are exchanged for money, but there are other ways that economic transactions can be made. And so specifically, there are going to be 4 different types of markets that we are going to explore throughout this entire IB course. Okay, it's going to include forex, stock, factor, and international financial markets. Now, we're not going to get into too much detail about these right now, but just so you know, the reason why these are separated is because they either sell different things or they sell to different demographics, or they just include different stakeholders than the rest. But again, after we get into especially macroeconomics, we're going to be looking at these in more detail and how they differ. But for now, let's just suffice it with general descriptions, okay? So let's begin with the most common, okay? A product market sells products, and that's where goods and services are bought and sold. Very basic and the most common. For example, Apple sells phones and computers, so they sell goods, and then the service might be fixing your Apple computer if you have insurance for it, okay? So consumers buy that, and then Apple sells it. Okay, factor markets are where factors of production are bought and sold, such as the labor market. So if you guys remember how we talked about the factors of production in the last video, you remember that there's 4 types of them, okay? And as long as we remember the acronym, MILK, we should remember all 4, okay? Management, land, labor, and capital stock, okay? So factor markets are markets that sell specifically factors of production that are later used for producers to use to produce their products, okay? So for example, it said, such as the labor market. So for example, if there is a McDonald's down the street and McDonald's is handing out flyers to try to find workers to work at the counter, that would be considered a labor market, okay? They're looking for people to fill the labor market, and that would be considered a factor of production because it's offering the factor of production labor to McDonald's, okay? Next is stock markets, where shares in companies are bought and sold. Now, we're going to get into this in a lot more detail later on in the course, but stocks, if you don't know what they are basically these little portions in companies that can be bought and sold to consumers. And they can be traded with, and they can go up in value over time, and people sell them and resell them. And there's so many different things you can do with stocks, but specifically, stock markets is just anything to do with only stocks, okay? And lastly, we have international financial markets, where international currencies are traded, such as the foreign exchange market. Again, this will be focused on in a lot more detail during macroeconomics because obviously this isn't going to be focusing on individual markets, it's going to be focusing on global macro markets, okay? So we're going to look at this in a lot more detail later, so don't worry if you don't understand it right now. And the chances of you being asked a question about these types of markets in an exam are actually quite low, but just in case you are asked about them, just to remember, a market can easily be defined by what products are sold in it, okay? Are they selling products? Are they selling factors of production, stocks, or are they trading international currencies? Okay, so now let's actually get into the bulk of this lesson, and we're going to introduce a new concept that we have to carry for the rest of our lives, unfortunately, called demand, okay? So demand, by definition, and just to be clear, every time I do introduce a definition for a term like demand or supply or whatnot, I would strongly suggest memorizing the textual definition from the textbook for each of the terms. Hence, you need to be able to define terms. So I'll start with demand. Demand is the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to purchase at different prices in a given period of time. So just breaking this down a little bit, this pretty much just makes sense, okay? Demand is measured by quantity, okay? Demand is to do with a good or a service. Ooh, let me move that down a little bit. That consumers are willing and able to purchase, okay? So just to be clear, demand curves, so I'm just gonna draw this just for a little introduction, but don't worry about it yet. This is called a demand curve, okay? And this is gonna be called a supply curve, which we're gonna look at in the supply unit. But the supply curve is gonna be the producer's curve, okay? So this is producers, and the demand curve is gonna be for consumers. This makes sense because producers produce product and they supply it, while consumers demand product and they consume it, okay? And just to be clear, another very aspect of this definition is consumers are willing and able to purchase, okay? That means they want to purchase it and that they actually can purchase it, okay? If they only have one or the other, it's completely useless, okay? Because just because I want to buy a Mercedes doesn't mean I can afford to. And so that wouldn't change demand at all. And just because I can afford to buy a Mercedes, but I don't want to, that's not going to do anything to the market either, okay? And they're able to purchase it at different prices, okay? So this basically refers to no market, micro or macro, in the entire world is completely competition free. Okay, so if we're talking about cars, you might have one company selling a car for $20,000 and another company selling a car for $40,000. Okay, and the fact that there's different prices throughout the market shows that consumers are willing to purchase products at these different prices. Okay, and obviously, as shown with the PPC graph in the previous video, every single graph, it's not specified, but every single graph does take place in a given time period, okay? Demand is also split into two categories, effective and ineffective demand. So effective and ineffective demand is basically just an extension of the point that I made about the definition of demand just before, which is we're going to be looking at the terms willing and able, okay? Willing would be want, and then able would be you're actually able to do something, okay? The important phrase here is the willingness and ability. It is not enough for consumers to be willing to purchase a good or a service. They must also have the financial means to buy the product. That is the ability to buy. And so this is really straightforward if you think about it. Ineffective demand is when consumers are willing but are not able to buy something. So it's ineffective because it doesn't affect the market in any way because no economic action is being pursued, okay? It's just consumers over here kind of saying, oh, I kind of want that Mercedes, but I can't buy it. On the other hand, effective demand is where consumers make choices that do affect the demand in the marketplace. So consumers are both willing and able to buy that Mercedes. And I'm going to introduce you now to a pattern you will see constantly throughout the syllabus, which is under every single or almost every single topic, such as demand, there's always going to be a law, okay? There's always going to be a law or a rule or just a small explanation as to why demand works the way it works, okay? And to do it by definition, the law of demand simply states that as the price of a product falls, the quantity demanded of the product will usually increase, ceteris paribus. It is sometimes expressed even more simply as the demand curve normally slopes downwards. Okay, the law of demand may be illustrated using either a demand schedule or a demand curve. Okay, so let's go ahead and break this down a little bit again. Okay, so remember how on the other slide I literally just showed you a very broad example of a demand graph. So on every single graph that has to do with demand, you're going to get a line, typically a straight line that slopes downward from left to right. Okay, it's gonna have like a negative gradient like this. Okay, sometimes you'll have it straight like this, and usually you'll have it straight, but sometimes you get it like this, okay? Just to be clear, these don't mean different things. Okay, some exam teachers prefer the curve because it's more realistic, but typically, just to simplify graphs even more, a straight line is super common, but they both mean the exact same thing, okay? So the law of demand basically explains why does it go in that downward shape anyway, okay? And that's because as the price of a product falls, the quantity demanded of the product will usually increase, okay? So we're gonna be looking at actual diagrams on the next few slides, but for now, just know that on a very simple basis, this is $1 and this is $2, okay? If you think about it on a math axis, it starts with minimum X and then it goes to maximum X, and the same with Y, okay? So let's say, oh, sorry, this is quantity and this is price. So this is quantity of one product, quantity of two products. Price of one, price of two. Okay, so as you can see, as the price of a product falls, so as it goes from here to here, demand increases, okay? If you looked at where the point 2 crosses the curve, only 1 unit of product would be demanded. Whereas if the price is 1 and it crosses here, and let's say it crosses at 2 units are being demanded. So as you can see, as the price of a product falls, quantity demanded of the product will usually increase. Now, I mentioned this in the last video. This is a phrase you're going to use all the time, ceteris paribus. And if you didn't watch the last video, it basically just means that assuming everything else in the graph and in the market stays the same in the given time period that it takes place in, this is the only change that's going to happen, okay? So if you ever just want to use this term, especially in essays, because that's a great idea that the IB loves, every time you talk about a movement or a shift in a curve on a graph, use the phrase ceteris paribus at the end of the sentence, okay? However, to simplify the law of demand, it is sometimes expressed as more simply as the demand curve slopes downwards, like this, okay? The law of demand may be illustrated using a demand schedule or a demand curve. Now, we've talked about curves before with the PPC curve. Any line that you see in an economic diagram is called a curve, okay? And I was confused about this at first, but a curve does not need to be curved to be called a curved. So for example, this is a straight line, this is a curved line. They mean the same thing, but they're both called curves. But another more unique term that isn't used quite often is a schedule, okay? If you see the term schedule, that also just means the curve in a graph, okay? And really quickly, before we move to the next slide, I want to talk about the law of demand again, okay? Because if we think about it logically, the law of demand works. Because for example, if you go to the grocery store and there is somebody selling milk for a super expensive price, don't you think less people are going to buy it for the super expensive price than the amount of people that are going to buy the super cheap milk? This completely makes sense, as the more expensive a product is, the less amount of people are going to buy from it, and therefore the demand, or the quantity demanded rather, is going to be less. Hence, if producers are selling something that is cheaper, there's going to be more quantity demanded of it. However, they're just making less profit on each unit. Okay, finally, we can get to a professional looking graph for demand. So really quickly, before we look at anything over here, this is a curved graph at the moment. However, if we did that's a really bad line, but if we did a straight line like that would mean the same thing, just to be clear. But for now, let's work with what we have here, which is a curved demand schedule. Okay, so now let's look at some graph theory behind it. Again, continuing the law of demand, we're going to be looking at how certain values attribute to building a demand graph. So really quickly, let's look at some unique features that we see on the graph, okay? We have the curve, first of all, and then we have the axes. So axes is going to start at 0 in this corner always for both the y and the x axes. So I'm going to put this here just for the moment, but in the future, you do not and should not label it as x and y. Just for the moment, let's do it just to organize ourselves, okay? On the y graph, in microeconomics, on the y graph, it is always going to be the price, okay? The price of a product, and these are all in the value of dollars. So this is a mistake I always make in my economic essays. But every time you want to talk about the price of something on the y-axis and you're going to use a certain currency, whether it be dollars, pounds, euros, yuan, or whatever, you are going to put the currency here, okay? Not on the individual numbers here, but rather here. Okay, and on microeconomic graphs on the x-axis, it's always going to be quantity demanded, okay? Is it going to be 100 quantity demanded, or is it going to be 300, okay? And this basically just means, oh, if I'm a producer and I'm selling flowers, in any given time period, am I selling 100 flowers or am I selling 300 flowers? So that means that these are units of demand. So 400 units, 300 flowers, or 400 flowers, okay? So now let's look over here. This is basically just an example of a table that is used to make this graph. So if we're looking at this graph and it's quantity and price of soft drinks, we would label this graph. This graph doesn't have a label, but all graphs that you draw really should. Okay, soft drinks. Okay, let's just make it a super general we're just going to make it a super general name for the moment, soft drinks, just to organize ourselves, okay? We're going to look price of soft drinks, okay? And it goes lower and lower, $2, $1.2, 80 cents, 40 cents. And as we can see here, it starts at the most of $2 and then makes its way down. Same with quantity demanded. However, this time it goes up as from the left to the right. the x-axis always goes up from 100 to 400. Here it goes up from 100 to 400, okay? And based on the law of demand that we just talked about, you can see that if this right here, this place is going right above $1, so this is going to be, let's label it number 1. That's $1.20. That's the first price. And then the second price is right below it. Okay, it's 80 cents. And at this price of $1.20, 150 units are being demanded. Okay, hence, if you go across 120 and you go down to the x-axis, this is about where 150 units takes place. Okay, same with 80 cents. 80 cents, which is a decrease in the price, will cause an increase in the quantity to 225. Again, let's go across at 80 cents. Oh, we land at 225. So just so you know, if you ever get asked a question about plotting a graph, whether it's for demand or any other concept, and using a table for the y and the x-axes, this is essentially how it works, okay? And the reason why we have these dotted lines on the graph at the moment is just to show that relationship and to prove the law of demand, okay? See how there is an increase in quantity when there's a decrease in price. Okay, that's a very important concept to understand. But again, using the textbook, let's define the graph further. This is a curve that shows the relationship, between the price of a product, which is placed on the vertical axis, and the quantity demanded of the same product over time, which is placed on the horizontal axis. So essentially, if you ever need to describe this, just try to talk about how it's a relationship between the x and the y-axis. And once again, in case you don't believe me, a change in the price of soft drinks from 120 to 80 cents leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of the soft drinks from 150 to 125, as you can see with the dotted lines here. But now I'm going to introduce you to yet another term that's going to be super common when talking about demand. It's going to be a change in demand. So what is the change in demand? Well, when economists talk about a change in demand, they're actually referring to a shift of the demand curve to the right or left. This is different to the phrase change in the quantity demanded, which we came across earlier. Now, these two terms are super important that you don't get them confused, okay? Now, I know they look the exact same, and I misuse them so much, but now I can tell you the difference, okay? So first of all, if we go back to the last video, you'll remember a PPC curve, okay? And remember how I said, oh, this is the basic PPC curve, but if you do X, Y, and Z, you can actually move the PPC curve from that to this, okay? You see how it shifts. A shift is what happens when an entire curve moves, okay? But when a curve doesn't move, like actually to the left, to the right, to up or down, and we just draw these dotted lines on it, that's called a movement, okay? So when economists talk about a change in demand, they're talking about a shift. So, okay, change in demand is equal to a shift, okay? A shift is when the whole curve moves. Okay, and if you don't understand this, I highly suggest writing it down because the terminology here is so important for when it comes to exams, I swear. Okay, and then a change in the quantity demanded, hence a change shown in the quantity on the x-axis, change in quantity demanded, equals a movement. Okay, so for example, at this first graph demand that we've been looking at for the past few slides, because as we can see, there are dotted lines here, but the curve itself isn't actually moving. Okay, if we drew another curve here, and then it went up like this per se, that would be a shift, okay? But that doesn't exist in this context. So just our little drawings here and us showing how this is explained using the table and the law of demand within itself is just showing a change in the quantity demanded, hence a movement of the curve. See how it touches right here? It's movement on it. All right, so now that we have the basic foundation of understanding demand down, let's talk about what determines demand. Okay, so there are going to be a number of factors that determine demand and lead to an actual shift of the demand curve to either right or left. I'm going to go ahead and do a very simple illustration for you. Let's say we have a market and this is the demand curve, okay? The demand curve can move in 4 directions, really. It can move to the right, it can move to the left, or it can move, let me draw it over here. It can move up, and it can move down, very basic stuff. However, it kind of all means the same thing, okay? When a curve moves to the right or when it moves up, that means it is increasing in some way, okay? Demand is increasing because remember, if an x-axis works like 0 and then like 1, it keeps increasing as you go along, okay? So anytime that demand moves from here to here, assuming there's a dotted line here and a dotted line here, this could be 1 unit of product and this could be 2 units of product, okay? Hence, demand is increasing to 2 units of quantity demanded, okay? And that can be displayed either by shifting it to the right or shifting it up. It means basically the same thing because as you can see, if the tail of this one ends here, the tail of this one ends here. Okay, so it really just depends on your style of drawing graphs. Typically, I do it to the left or to the right because it's just easier to draw and it's easier to show. As you guys can see, it's further apart here than it is here, but it's really up to you. Okay, and the same thing goes for moving it to the left or moving it down. That means demand is decreasing, okay, because it's going backwards. It's going back along and getting smaller. Hence, if it's 1 here and it's 2 here, obviously going backwards, we're going to get, 0.1. Oh, sorry, 0.5. Okay, and that means demand is decreasing. So when it says a shift of the demand curve to either the right, the left, also known here as up and down. But getting back to determinants, whenever we look at a change in one of the determinants of demand, and we will be listing and explaining them, we always make the ceteris paribus assumption. Really quickly, for me to redefine this, ceteris paribus is, I think it's French, and it basically just means we're shifting the graph assuming that everything else stays the same, okay? So whenever we look at a change in a determinant, because a change in consumer preference, for example, will shift the demand either left or right, we always assume that the consumer's choice here is the only thing impacting it, or else we would be so messy and graphs would be so complex. And considering we are economic students and not actual economists, we do not have to worry about that right now. Okay, so now we can stop learning something new and learning theory, and now it's time to use actual logic, okay? I want you to consider something that you bought in the past month, perhaps, and I want you to consider what influenced why you wanted to buy it, okay? We're going to be listing about 6 or 7 different influences or things that determine demand. So that phrase before, determinants of demand, yeah, we're going to be looking at those, okay? The first of which is income. So for most goods, as income rises, the demand for the product will also rise. When people have higher incomes, they can afford to buy more goods, so the demand will increase. Such goods are known as normal goods, okay? If the product is considered to be inferior, then demand for the product will fall as income rises and the consumer starts to buy higher price substitute in place of the inferior good. Now, you're being introduced to 2 new words here, inferior goods and normal goods, okay? So let's break down the beginning first, okay? So think about it like this. If you're earning $60 an hour, okay, let's say you're earning $60 an hour and then per day you make, let's say you're working 10 hours, okay? You make $600 a day. And let's say your income increases and then leads to you making twice as much, okay? $120 an hour, which would lead to $1,200, oh, that's not a good number, $1,200 a day, okay? Obviously, many things in your life will change if your income somehow magically, doubles in quantity. But one big thing that does change is what you buy. So to relate this to your own life, I want you to consider if you make money in any type of way, or you ever have, consider what you bought before you made as much money as you made now, or what you bought when you had less than you did now, okay? So for most goods, as income rises, the demand for the product will also rise, okay? This makes sense because if, vacations are a very common example used for these graphs. So let's write that down here. So if a vacation to the Canary Islands, okay, let's say a cost to the Canary Islands costs $1,200, okay? Well, obviously before I only had half of that. I only had 50%, so I could not afford it. Hence, I would be willing but not able to buy that product or service, okay? Hence, at that moment, my demand curve would stay right here because I wouldn't buy anything, so nothing would change. However, if my income did increase and then I was suddenly willing and able to buy the vacation as a service, my demand would increase from the quantity of, well, realistically, this would be 0 if I didn't buy anything before. And now the quantity would shift to 1. I bought 1 vacation with it, okay? So the quantity would increase and the demand curve In this style, they're shifting it to the right, but again, you can shift it up and it basically means the same thing. But just to not be confused, something to explain with this example is that you will basically never see microeconomic graphs that focus on one individual person, okay? Because remember, this is supposed to be one market, not one person. I was just using this as an example. So for being serious, let's say 1,000 employees at a company were able to increase the revenue from this to this, then maybe it would go from 0 to 80, okay, 80 to begin with, and then it would increase from 80 to 200, okay? It might look something more like that in an exam, but just so you know, it's not focused on just one person, it's focused on one market. So as long as that makes sense to you, then it can also make sense to you that this can totally be reversed. So let's delete these, and let's say the opposite happened, okay? Let's say Corona hit and you lost half of your revenue, okay? And you went down from $1,200 a day to $600 a day. Okay, obviously, then in this case, demand would not increase, but demand would decrease, okay? So they didn't show it on this graph, but I'll try to draw it, okay? Instead of moving from here to here, it would move from this first curve to here. Okay, and something else I would like to point out to you guys is I mentioned it in the PPC curve, but the way we label curves is so important. So the first curve that you start off with is always going to be the letter associated with it, okay? And we'll be introduced to that as we're introduced to the curves themselves. The second curve that is added, so for example, if it's increased, that's going to be a second curve. It's D1, okay? You can see right here. And if I shifted it this way and this curve didn't exist, this would also be called D1. Okay, and don't worry, we'll practice this more later on, okay? So for the record, it's really important. I said most goods. I didn't say all goods because income affects different goods in different ways, okay? So for example, most goods are normal goods, meaning that they follow this rule. And I'm sure if you think about it in your life, most things, if your income did rise a stupid amount, you would buy more of or less of, depending if you got more or got less income, okay? Whether it be, I don't know, fancy restaurant bookings, whether it be technology, vacations, super common one, whatever, most things in your life are gonna be normal goods, okay? However, there's also gonna be the opposite effect. If a product is considered to be inferior, then demand for a product will fall as income rises, okay? Now I'm gonna take away everything I just threw on the graph. An inferior good is just the opposite of a normal good. And I know you're thinking, if this makes so much sense, then how can there be inferior goods? How does that make sense? Okay, well, I want you to consider, let's say I use the example of vacations to the Caribbean, I think. Yeah, okay, the Caribbean. Okay, let's say vacations to the Caribbean, it costed $1,200, okay? And while you couldn't afford a vacation to the Caribbean before, you could afford a vacation to Mexico before, okay? And the vacation to Mexico was $600. So I have to draw another additional graph here. But okay, before the demand curve was here for your vacations to Mexico and you were buying them because you just couldn't afford to go to the Caribbean at the moment. As your income increased again and you were able to buy that Caribbean vacation, hence you increased the quantity demanded. That also means that you're not buying a vacation to Mexico anymore, okay? Hence, it would decrease. Okay, these are supposed to be straight lines. Leave me alone. I'm trying so hard. Okay, but if the vacations increase here, then they would decrease here because you were only really using a vacation to Mexico as a substitute to the vacations to the Caribbean islands, okay? So this would be considered an inferior good because an increase in your demand has reduced how much you're buying of this, okay? And once again, this can apply to not just vacations, but I think clothes is also a really good example to talk about. For example, a lot of people go to Goodwill. If you're in the States, you know what I'm talking about. Goodwill is like a secondhand store that people might go to because they can't afford to buy clothes firsthand. Hence, if you got more income and you were actually able to buy clothes firsthand, your quantity demanded for Goodwill clothes would decrease because you're buying less of it now, and instead, this would increase and you're buying more firsthand clothes, okay? So this is an inferior good and this is going to be a normal good. And remember, each shift in income, and I should have specified that here, each good shifts the demand curve in a different direction depending on the determinant of income. Okay, next determinant, I should start labeling these. Number 2, the price of related goods, also known as the price of other goods in the same market. There are 3 possible relationships between products. They may be substitutes for each other, complements to each other, or unrelated, okay? But really quickly, let's talk about this as a generic, like, determinant of demand, okay? The price of related goods. Let's use the market of phones. Very basic, but okay. Let's think about what companies sell phones, okay? You have Apple, number one. You have Samsung, which is what I have. And then you have Windows. Did you guys know Windows sell phones? They do. And they're really bad, but we're not going to talk about that right now, okay? So the prices of related goods, okay? This is all part of the same market because they're all selling phones. However, obviously, because of competition, they're all going to price their things differently unless there's some type of like oligopoly like situation going on, but that's for macroeconomics, so don't worry about that right now. But the price of related goods. Okay, so let's say you're aiming to buy an Apple phone for, in some magical universe, let's say an Apple phone is $100, okay? That's never going to happen, but let's say it was back in like 2005, okay? However, the price of a Samsung, because Samsungs are typically cheaper, let's say it's half, let's say it's 50, okay? And then Windows, nobody buys Windows, so that's gonna be like 10, okay? No one buys Windows phones ever. So the price of related goods, if you enter the phone market to buy a phone and you aim to buy an Apple phone, but then you see the price of other goods in the same market that are 50 and then 10, that might like tank your decision to buy an Apple phone, okay? Hence, influencing the market in a different way and making the choice of you as a consumer influence demand, okay? And this is an example right here of substitute goods. Hence, goods that can be used that substitute one another. You can easily replace an Apple phone with a Samsung or a Samsung with a Windows phone. There's not really a big distinction between them that make them so different, I would argue. So they can basically just be used interchangeably, okay? However, there's also two more types of goods, okay? You have complement goods, which are goods that are bought together. So for example, think of it like printers and ink, okay? Goods are usually bought together and have like a similar increase or decrease in demand because they're bought together so much. Or unrelated goods, okay? That's the last category, and that just means phones and printers, okay? There's not a direct correlation between those, so that would be neither of these two, okay? They're just unrelated. And we'll get into more detail about these three terms later on. But just so you know, all three product relationships cause a shift in the demand curve, either to the left or to the right, as we will see. Okay, so going into more detail with the price of related goods as a determinant of demand, we can see two graphs, so don't be scared, okay? Really quickly though, before we read this, I want to show you guys this is a perfect example of movement on the demand curve in a shift in the demand curve, okay? If you don't understand the difference at this point, I don't know what else to say, but there's two curves here and there's one curve here, shift, movement, okay? So if products are substitutes for each other, then a change in the price of one product will lead to a change in the demand for the other product. So that probably sounds super wonky to you and super just like not to the point, but essentially it just means if we're going to be looking at phones again, let's say this is Apple right here, Apple, Samsung, okay? So essentially that just means if you buy an Apple phone, okay, your demand is going to increase, okay? And let's say you choose to buy an Apple instead of a Samsung. Okay, and you're going to substitute a Samsung with an Apple, then obviously Samsung's demand is going to decrease. So you see how one change in buying a certain product can influence the graphs and the markets for each of these companies when buying phones, okay? And so now when we're talking about price, a change in price of one of the products will lead to a change in the demand for the other. Okay, in terms of discussing price and how that affects the substitute change, let's look at this first diagram, okay? I'm going to label it number 1. So let's say we're looking at Apple phones here, okay? Let's say Apple phones, they were on sale from their incredible price of $100 to $80, okay? As we know by the law of demand by now, $100 is demanding this quantity of product. However, a decreased price to $80 is going to be increasing the quantity by that much, okay? So hence, if a product decreases and quantity demanded increases as a result, which by the way will cause a whole market change, and would cause a general shift in this direction, like Apple, well then obviously, as I just explained, it would cause a shift to the other side in other markets, okay, because it's now a substitute good. So for example, this is a very common tactic seen in super competitive markets where products will try to compete with each other in lowering the prices so that more people will buy it and that people would substitute other brands with their brand and increase demand overall, okay? In the same way, an increase in the price of a substitute product will lead to a fall in the quantity demanded of that product and an increase in demand. Shift of the demand curve to the right. Okay, so now let's pretend that these arrows are shaped the other way. okay? And we're going to be increasing price, okay? We're going to be decreasing quantity. Let's say Apple was on sale for $80, but then it went back to full market price. Quantity demanded is going to decrease, and you're going to go back here. So when quantity demanded decreases, then the market for Apple is going to be shifting the other way. It's going to be shifting down. And as less is demanded, then Samsung is actually going to be shifting this way. Okay, so you guys see how the opposite effect also takes place. Apple decreases overall, and then Samsung, as a substitute good, increases overall, okay? And really quickly, just before we leave the slide, let's look at graph number 2 for a second, okay? This is just to show you and kind of introduce you to the idea. So you guys know how I defined these different graphs as being movements versus shifts, okay? Movements on a graph are dictated by price, okay? Hence why there's two different square things going on, okay? That's because price is moving. It's either decreasing or increasing. And in the opposite way, price here is the same, but quantity demanded is decreasing or increasing in a different way. However, the curve is shifting, hence a shift in the demand curve versus a movement on it. And next to substitute goods is essentially the complete opposite of that. We have complement goods, and complement goods are exactly as they sound. They're goods that you buy together, okay? They're complements to each other. So a really common example of this you'll see is printers and ink, okay? And by definition, complements are products that are often purchased together, i.e. Printers and ink. And if products are complements to each other, then a change in price of one of the products will lead to a change in the demand for the other product. Okay, so for example, if a price decreases from P to P1, like right here, and we know that because of the law of demand, that will increase quantity from Q to Q1, if that happens for one complementary good, like let's say this is printers, then we know that if we have another graph for ink, the same thing is basically going to happen. So if price decreases and quantity demanded increases for one, it's going to happen to the other, which overall will lead to a shift in the demand curve if demand increases, and if price decreases, then a movement alongside the demand curve, just like what we said before, okay? And as far as complementary goods increasing demand, the same thing happens when you decrease demand for complementary goods, okay? So an increase in the price of a complementary product, such as printers and ink, will lead to a fall in the quantity demanded of that product and a fall in demand, a shift of the demand curve to the left. So in the same way, if all this happens but reversed and we go from Q1 to Q and P1 to P and demand decreases, then we're actually going to get a curve over here as it shifts to the left instead of the right, and demand decreases overall. So we're basically just using the same concepts as before as to understand how some products are actually good together, and how, unlike substitute products where you buy one instead of the other, you buy one, you get the other in this case. And last but not least, we have goods that don't fall into either substitute or complementary goods. We have goods that are unrelated. Once again, it's exactly like it sounds. Unrelated goods are goods that aren't related, okay? They have nothing to do with the demand for each other. So if a product is unrelated, then a change in the price of one product will have no effect upon the demand product for the other. So by just doing some super simple diagrams right here, let's say that price decreases for one, so we know that demand increases. So let's use an example of unrelated goods. Let's do toasters and TVs. Now, the point of this is to choose two goods that are unrelated, so the demand for TVs has nothing to do with your demand for toasters, okay? Because, like, relevantly speaking, they don't affect each other in the same way as a TV versus an iPad would, for example, or a toaster versus a microwave would, okay? They're unrelated enough that one does not affect the other in terms of demand. So if demand decreases for toasters, it will not necessarily decrease nor increase for TVs because it's just completely unrelated. All right, so now we're going to hit the third determinant of demand, coming back to that, which is going to be tastes and preferences and how they impact demand. Now, I can say from experience on IB tests, taste and preferences is probably the most likely determinant of demand for products in the real world. And so when you use real examples in an IB exam, this is the most likely determinant of demand. And that's because taste and preferences is such a broad range of things that you can think about, okay? So imagine how many products you don't get or you do get on the daily, because you prefer them or you don't prefer them, for example. Okay, so if we're taking this into the context, if tastes change in favor or not in favor of a particular product, then more will be demanded at every price. When tastes change so that a given product becomes less popular, then demand will fall and the demand curve will shift to the left. So it's basically just the same diagram as before, we're just repeating it now. But basically, this D curve shifts to the D1 curve as tastes increase. So for example, let's say we're becoming vegan, okay? And we suddenly increase the demand for carrots. I know that's a stereotype, but let's say we're increasing demand for carrots because we're not eating meat anymore, okay? Our tastes for carrots have changed because, well, let's say we like them more now because we are vegan. We're gonna increase the demand from D to D1, okay? And the same thing can just happen with almost anything, okay? And the reason why this determinant in general is the most popular is because it's applicable to literally anything that you can think about. For example, if you go to Germany and you try a pizza, I don't know, for the first time and it's amazing and you want to buy so much more of it, then you're increasing demand because your taste and preferences for that product increase. But however, the same thing can happen when tastes and preferences make you less likely or will decrease your demand of a product. So for example, in Unit 1.1, if you haven't seen that video already, I recommend you watch it because it's the introduction to IB Economics course. But in that intro video, I used the example of Nutella being exposed for being like one of the biggest contributors to palm oil and how that leads to deforestation, and after palm oil got banned from like Iceland and many other countries for just being bad for the environment, that decreased the demand for products with palm oil in it, like shampoo or like Nutella. So in fact, the opposite would happen in this case. So tastes and preferences decrease because we don't want palm oil in our stuff anymore. So our demand just decreases instead from D1 to D. And very generally speaking, some different things can affect our tastes and preferences, such as marketing and advertising. Companies that prevented deforestation and like funded charities for that advertised how products like Nutella did have palm oil in them and how they contributed to destroying the environment. So that's advertising. Okay, some things like peer pressure and media influence. So for example, peer pressure, that becomes more of like a thing for increasing demand for alcohol, drugs, vapes is a super common one nowadays. And then media influence. There's a reason why on Instagram, all the Kardashians have sponsorships with hair vitamins, okay? That's because it makes some consumers more likely to increase their demand as they see influencers doing the same thing. Number 4, we're going to be looking at a little bit of investment in this one. This is future price expectations and what you would do with that. So generally speaking, if consumers think that a price of a product will increase in the future, then they may well demand more of that product in the present, taking advantage of the current lower prices. This will lead to a shift of the demand curve for the product to the right. Now, because we've seen the demand curve so many times, we don't really need a detailed illustration, but by now, this should basically be memorized. When you increase demand, it shifts to the right or up. But a good example of this is, we'll be talking more about this in Unit 3 with macroeconomics. But when people try to study the business cycle, for example, to try to estimate when inflation is going to peak and then when a recession is going to be the trough, that will completely determine when people choose to buy things. So for example, if this point right here is inflation, when everything is the most expensive, people will probably not buy things now if they can wait for it. If they have the patience, they will not buy things when they're the most expensive because they know if they wait till a recession when things are way cheaper, that they can buy it for a way cheaper price and get the exact same product. And the same thing just continues on. So if we go back to inflation here, if somebody buys something during a recession when it's really cheap, and maybe they have hopes to invest in that product and to sell it in the future when they can sell it at maximum price, then they will buy more of that product or demand more of that product right now in the present and take advantage of the lower prices here, which will increase demand right now in this current time period to prepare for the future, kind of like a form of investment. Okay, and the same thing can happen the opposite way, of course. So if consumers expect the price of a product to fall in the future, they may demand less of that product in the present, postponing their demand until a future date. So that was basically what I already said, which is if you know a product is going to be more expensive today and then it's going to be way cheaper in a month, you might just wait a month if it isn't a necessity and you can wait that long, okay? This will lead to a shift of the demand curve to the left. So we'll be talking about the opposite way instead. Obviously, number of consumers overall determines how much demand there's going to be in a society or an economy overall. So if there's an increase in the number of consumers of a product, then there will be a shift in the demand curve to the right. This will be reflected in the demand patterns for certain products. So just to be clear, this determinant is super straightforward. So let's say there's a society with 5,000 people in its economy, and the whole society, so the whole economy, is buying bread. The demand of that society or that economy for bread will be 5,000 people. That's the quantity demanded. However, if there's a competing economy that has 1,000,000 people and all 1,000,000 people buy bread, well then obviously as the populations increase, that the quantity demanded is also going to increase for the other society. So here it's really just a numbers game, okay? And the same thing with the opposite. If a society or an economy loses a bunch of people, then quantity demanded will decrease overall just because there's less consumers overall in an economy. And just if you're interested, a good evaluation point for this is to consider how the different demographics of an increasing or decreasing population is affecting the demand for certain products. So like I just said, we'll talk about it more later, but there's a difference between elastic and inelastic goods. So if an economy increases its amount of people, let's say from 5K to 1 mil, how is that going to change the demand for inelastic or necessity goods compared to elastic goods, like water, housing compared to elastic goods? So as we know, depending on the type of product, there might be a huge leap, or in reality, there really might not. All right, so now that we're done with the determinants, we are going to review some vocabulary really quickly, which is so important for especially paper 1 for economics when you write your own essays. You're going to hear two very common words when talking about basic economic graphs: shifts and movements. And as I've already explained before, I'm just going to review it again, is when one of the determinants of demand changes and it shifts one quantity to another, okay? So as we just reviewed, there's 5 different determinants of demands to know, but I'm going to write that right here. So change, also known as delta, in a DOD, determinant of demand. Okay, that's what makes this shift in the demand curve. And just to be clear, a shift is when there's a whole new demand curve because it just moves so much. Whereas a movement alongside the demand curve is caused by a change in price. So anything that's not related to a determinant of demand is a change in price. As we can see right here, price changes here. It doesn't change here, but price changes here, which then causes a change in the quantity demanded. So we'll be focusing on the price aspect of it here. Okay, and as you can see, a huge difference between a movement alongside the curve is that there's only one curve here. There's not two, okay? Okay, so this next part I've never seen in an economics test, and quite honestly, most people don't really bring it up, so this probably isn't the most necessary concept to know, but I still think it's quite interesting. So there's something out there called Veblen Goods, which is a type of good that is an exception to everything we just learned so far. So for context, an economist named Thorsten Veblen identified a different situation where he claimed that the quantity demanded rose as price rose. These have come to be known as Veblen Goods. So right here is an exception to the classic demand curve we've been studying, whereby there's this point called snob value status, where when a product reaches a certain price level, demand actually increases instead of decreases. So it's not linear, okay? It's not linear now. It's like a sideways palabra. And if you're thinking about what products actually increase in demand as the price increases, well, actually most luxury goods, if you think about it, all like the fancy brands like, I don't know, Chanel, Louis Vuitton, Gucci, all these branded, really rich brands that are so expensive, you can see that demand often increases as price increases because people just put more value on it. And there are quite a few people out there. It's not uncommon for people to spend more money on products that specifically make them look rich. So that's where like luxury goods and these brands come in. And I actually have a really funny example. So when I was in 5th grade, was the year that the brand Supreme, if anyone's ever heard of it, the year that the brand Supreme began releasing t-shirts and bricks that had the word Supreme on it. And somebody actually bought one of the Supreme bricks for $30 and brought it to my school. But it was so funny because as the bricks rose in price and as the t-shirts rose in price, I saw a real life example of people actually buying more of it because it has that snob value status, as he says right here. And part of the reason for this whole concept in the first place, he attributed to conspicuous consumption, also known as the fact that people gain satisfaction from being seen to consume expensive products by other people. So kind of the thing I just said, which is there's a certain genre of people that want to be seen as being able to buy expensive things because that makes them appear more rich to other people, which is exactly what it's saying right here, okay? You're consuming something and you're being conspicuous about it because you're buying it for the effect that it has on other people. However, as the price continues to rise, the product eventually achieves, once again, this equilibrium, this snob value status, and further price rises start to lead to increases in the quantity demanded by those who want to be seen to consume the good. Now, because no determinant of demand specifically is affecting the increase or the decrease of quantity demanded in this instance, the price would be showing a movement, that's not a straight line, whatever. You'll be showing a movement alongside this demand curve as you start here, and then you get to P1, and then you get here to P2, and you just go like that. So because the price is changing or the price is increasing, this would all be considered a movement on the curve. All right, so a break from the theory for a little bit. Let's take a look at calculations because there's always going to be math and calculations in economics. We're going to be looking at the difference between individual and market demands now. So by adding up the individual demands at each price, it is possible to calculate the total market demand. However, it is possible to construct the demand curve, just being that of the general demand curve, for a whole market, because remember in microeconomics, one curve is one market, by a process known as horizontal summing. So this is actually going to be the name of the calculating process we're going to do to change numerous individual demands into a market demand. Okay, so here is a table. Okay, this is the table, and then this is the graph example of if you're ever asked on a calculation test, specifically for paper 2, or rarely, but maybe on paper 3 if you're unlucky enough, it's going to be this table or graph construction that you have to fill out, okay? So while this is already here, you might actually be asked to construct these numbers. But based on the definition that we just saw and the fact that this process is called horizontal summing, you guys can assume that 600 plus 400 plus 600 equals 1600. This equals these three, and then these three equal 700, okay? This is all pretty logical, I would say, because individual markets is consumers. So consumer A, consumer B, and consumer C. And when you have multiple individuals or multiple consumers, that creates the market demand, which is just a sum of everything, okay? So for example, we can see how each of these contribute to a graph. So it's not really important to write about it right now, but if you ever get a question on a test to turn an individual or market demand into a graph, just relate the coordinates that we see in the price here and then the different consumer or market demands to their graphs. So as we can see, the prices are the same on all of these because the prices are same here. So they're going to be plotting 3 points at 5, 3, and 1. And as we can see for the prices, that's 5, 3, 1. So there's going to be 3 points because there's 3 coordinates here on every single graph. And now they're basically just going to plot the x-axis according to the actual quantity demanded. Okay, and so clearly the different consumers have different looking graphs. Okay, these two, consumer C and A, look more similar than consumer B, which has a way steeper like that and a more inelastic curve overall. And then when you get to market demand, since it's the sum of everything all together, but it's still at the same price, you're actually going to get the sum of all of these 3 columns so far at the same prices of before, so 5, 3, and $1. However, because you added it all together, you're basically going to get a curve that's the sum of all 3 of these. So the curve that has the average gradient, let's say, of all 3 of the curves or individual markets of before, okay? So the total market curve, which is this last one here, should be a perfect mix between all individual demand graphs. Okay, and if you are smart and you're taking standard level economics instead of higher level, you can leave the video right now because you're done with demand. But if you're like me and you've also been taking economics higher level, then I'm sorry, but we still got a little more work to do. And here's going to be the continuation of Unit 2.1 for us today if you're doing higher level economics. Okay, so you might have heard me say this earlier. Assumption underlying the law of demand. From standard level, the law of demand is just talking about how as price decreases, demand increases and vice versa. But there is going to be an assumption under that we do have to discuss. So when the price of a product falls, there's going to be an increase in the quantity demanded of the product for two reasons, okay? And these two reasons are also known as effects to basically explain and expand why the law of demand exists. The first of which is going to be the income effect. So when the price of a product falls, then people will have an increase in their real income, which reflects the amount that their incomes will buy. With this increase in real income, the people will likely be able to buy more of the product. So for anybody who is already confused by this, what it basically means is that, let's say you're buying a hamburger for $5, okay? And let's say you only have $10 with you. So you buy $5 and then you only have $5 left, okay? This $5 is going to be known as real income because it's what they have of their income at the moment that they can actively buy, okay? But in comparison, if we buy a hamburger for $10 and we have $10, we're going to have $0 left, okay? And we're going to be broke, and that's going to be our real income again. So as we see, as the price decreases, we have more money to spend on products, which really makes sense because if the price of a product falls and we know that we get more real income and we save money essentially from buying a lower priced product, then we're going to increase our demand of the lower priced product or the $5 hamburger instead of the $10 hamburger. In this case, because we want to save $5 instead of $0. Okay? And in this context, the difference in real income relates to the increase or decrease in the consumer's disposable income following a change in price of the products that they're demanding. As we can see, the change is from $5 to $0. The change between that is $5. Okay, and the second assumption underlying the law of demand or explaining why it exists is the substitution effect, okay? So it is argued that people receive a certain amount of satisfaction or benefit when they consume a product. This satisfaction is known as utility. So this is a very important concept, but essentially it's just stating outright that we buy things because we get benefits from them, which absolutely makes sense. Like, why would we buy something if we don't want it or it wouldn't help us in some way? Okay, so every single thing we buy gives us some utility or benefit in some way. Okay, so when the price of a product falls, people will still gain the same amount of satisfaction or utility from the product as before, but they will be paying less for it. So the ratio of satisfaction to price will have improved. And I'm going to be able to explain this in the next slide using my own graphs, but we're going to be measuring a consumer satisfaction or benefit. It's measured as something called utils. So if you're ever asked to calculate this, quite literally using figures or numbers, put utils after it because they like seeing that unit. Okay, so now I'm going to compare the $5 and the $10 hamburger once again. Sorry that my graphs are kind of messy. So if we create this demand curve here, okay, let's do $10, $5, and $0. And in contrast, we're going to do $0, $3, and $5. So this is going to be $5, $5 hamburger, and then this is going to be the $10 hamburger, okay? So we're going to see here how the quantity increases from, let's say, 0, 1, 2 on both. So basically, it's showing that if we buy one hamburger for $1, basically we cross it right here, then we get a certain amount of utility and satisfaction from that one hamburger. But as we consume more of a product, let's say we want 2 hamburgers, we're not getting as much satisfaction from the second hamburger as we got from the first one, okay? So let's say we were really hungry when we bought this hamburger. The first one was amazing, and it's exactly what we needed to fill our stomachs. And the second one, it still makes us more full, but it's not as necessary as the first one. This downward sloping demand curve basically shows that we were willing to pay, let's say right here is $4. We were willing to pay $4 for a hamburger. Okay, but down here, since the satisfaction or the utility of the second burger is less than that of the first, we're only willing to pay $1. So as you can see, if we continued this on and we went to quantity demanded of like 3 or 4, we can see as quantity demanded increases, our utility decreases, and our utility is proven by how much we are willing to pay the producers for our product, okay? And the same thing happens in contrast when you do something more expensive like a $10 hamburger, okay? The exact same thing happens, okay? So for $5, we're willing to buy 1 hamburger, and for 2 hamburgers, we are willing to pay, let's say, $2, okay? As you can see, quantity demanded increases, utility decreases. And as utility decreases, we don't want to pay as much because prices that people are willing to pay are a direct representation of how useful or util people assume those products to be. As we get more of the same product, it's less useful, hence we want to pay less for it. Okay, and then overall, how realistic are these assumptions? How realistic are the assumptions of the substitute and the income effect? Well, the final outcome of a fall in price on the quantity demanded of a product in the end be a combination of the income effect and the substitution effect. Okay, so that's really what the law of demand is built up of. And as far as assumptions of demand are, we've listed a few of them here, okay? So number one, let's say, in the standard economic model, it is assumed that consumers behave rationally. Now, we're going to explore this concept a little bit more later on in this higher level demand course, but basically it's the idea that consumers behave in super logical ways. They're never swayed by like outside opinion. They always know the exact prices of all the alternatives, and they know how producers make their product. They know how much it costs producers to make their product. So essentially it's the idea that consumers have this all-consuming and rational and logical knowledge before they consume something, and that's why they consume it. Okay? Number two, consumers will always seek to maximize their utility. Just like the assumption that producers are always looking to make money, consumers are always looking to buy stuff only that benefits them. Although, really quickly, this actually isn't true if you think about it in terms of like charities or whatever. For example, a lot of people donate to charities, which doesn't help them at all because they are losing money for literally no product, and in that case, they're not maximizing their utility. However, in most cases, one of the assumptions is the exact opposite of that. Okay, number three, in decision making, it is assumed that consumers act only in their self-interest. They do not take into account to the interest of others. So this might be connected to sustainability. Once again, bringing back the Nutella example because it's so good. If I really like Nutella and I don't care about the environment in, I don't know, South America, or I don't care about the Amazon rainforest being destroyed, for my own self-interest, I want to buy Nutella just because it tastes good, okay? But in reality, once again, this isn't true. If a million people boycotting Nutella because they do care and they do take into account the interests of others and the interests of sustainability, then we know that it does affect their decision making. Okay, and lastly, fourth assumption. It is assumed that when making decisions or choices, consumers have access to all the relevant information about their choices. This is known as the assumption of perfect information. So essentially, this one connects directly to the first. It's assuming that as consumers, whenever we make choices about what we're consuming or what we're demanding or what quantity we're demanding, we have access to all the knowledge, all the points, and all the decisions made from producers before we consume something. Now, consumers who meet all these assumptions, which realistically speaking is like never, are considered to be Homo economicus and part of the rational consumer model. Okay, so let's take a little trip away from economics for a second and focus on psychology, okay? Let's stop studying economics and let's just go back to reality for a second. So psychology clearly has a huge effect on evaluating why producers produce what they produce and why consumers consume what they consume. But we're going to be focusing more on consumers in this case because we're going to be looking at demand instead of supply. Okay? So obviously psychology is going to feed into why consumers, such as myself, do what we do. So to begin, an economist observed that a problem with the field of economics is that it studies the behavior of people that simply do not exist. The people who fall into that Homo economicus category literally don't exist because it's impossible to meet all those assumptions, because most of the assumptions and our access to like knowledge of producers, for example, is out of our control. We cannot control that, so therefore we cannot meet those assumptions. And to fix these assumptions, he started presenting the view that there is no such person as Homo economicus. And instead, he compared each of the points of econs to humans, okay, and why there's a difference between them. So let's quickly evaluate. Econs are rational. Realistically, we have bounded rationality, which we'll be looking at in way more detail later on, but let's circle that for now. Econs always have perfect information. We have incomplete information. It's almost impossible to have perfect information. Econs are extremely intelligent and able to perform complex calculations quickly. So basically, that's going to be how quickly are econs versus humans able to evaluate the utility of the products that they're going to buy or how much money they're going to save by getting a cheaper product. However, we have limited ability to carry out complex calculations without the help of like a calculator. And quite honestly, if you're going to the grocery store, I'm sure at a certain point you do not want to be evaluating how much utility you can get out of every jar of peanut butter to choose the best one. Okay, at a certain point, we just don't care. Econs maximize their own utility, but we are social beings and make decisions in a social context, and it's really easy for us to consider other people. So we aren't always making decisions based on our own self-interest. Econs have consistent preferences over time. However, think about how often you change what breakfast you want to eat in the morning, okay? We change all the time, and we change our preferences because of those changes as well. Econs say they have no self-control problems. So in terms of demerit goods like alcohol or cigarettes, some people just have to keep buying them because they're impulse to, okay? So that's what makes us human, is that we may have some self-control issues, whereas econs, they don't, and they know how to limit themselves to certain goods. Also, that they are unbiased. They're not swayed by what other people say, by what celebrities say, or by other people's opinions, whereas we most certainly are. So throughout everything we've just kind of shown so far, everything has led up to this thing called the rational consumer model, basically evaluating how rational us as consumers are. Okay, so there are many ways in which this model can be disproved, and discussing its realistic feasibilities with each of its assumptions. For example, in that table we just evaluated before. However, there are going to be 5 different sections in the rational consumer model, which is organized into imperfect information, bounded rationality, bounded selfishness, and bounded self-control, which are all terms that we already just introduced. So starting from the beginning again, the first point of the rational consumer model is going to be perfect versus imperfect information. In economic demand, this is the assumption that all economic agents have access to all the same information at the same time. This would imply that consumers have perfect information about the price and quality of all products in the market. Already right away, we've already disproven this. Be honest, if you go to the grocery store and you're still looking at peanut butter, do you know the price and quality of all the 20 brands of peanut butter? No, you don't, because no one's telling you that, so you don't have access to the information, okay? And that's shown here, as in the real world, there are information asymmetrics. So remember, symmetrical information is when everything is perfect and la-di-da, and asymmetrical or asymmetries is the opposite of that, where different economic agents, whether it be consumers, producers, and the government, have different levels of information available to them where economic transactions are concerned. Okay, so this is actually quite interesting. So basically, all 3 of these agents have different knowledge of X, Y, Z. So let's say we're looking at peanut butter. Again, what a surprise. Consumers, we only have the knowledge of peanut butter that's on the actual jar, on the ingredient list, in the moment that we're buying it, unless we look it up online. But once again, is that feasible? Is that realistic? I don't really know, and I don't really think so for peanut butter, for example. However, the people who produce peanut butter, they know everything about it. They know how it's made, what the quality's like, how much money they're earning from it. So they have knowledge of how the quality and price relate to their product and whether that's good or bad for consumers, okay? But consumers don't know that themselves. And as far as the government goes, well, the government's not producing it, but maybe they're subsidizing the production of peanut butter so they know what ingredients go into it because they're helping pay for them. They might also be concerned with health regulations, so they know, oh, how clean is the place in that it's made, and what's the likelihood of this being a clean and sanitary product. But once again, like consumers, they might not know the exact quality because the government typically doesn't measure the quality of a good, okay? And then also humans face limits in terms of how much they can actually process the information that is available to them. So let's say in some perfect world, there was a sheet of paper next to every product at the grocery store that told us everything about the product, how much it costs to make it, where it's made, how it's made, the ingredients, how much revenue producers are making, how sanitary it is, do they have subsidies, X, Y, Z, okay? Just because we might theoretically have access to all this information doesn't mean we can actually process it, okay? Like think about how many people right now in the world study economics or know what a subsidy is, okay? The majority of people won't understand terms like the word subsidy, unlike us and unlike me and hopefully you by the end of this course. And so they actually can't process it And so they actually won't be able to process this information because they don't know what a subsidy is. So what information or what relevance does that have to them? Okay. So therefore, due to all these three factors, in the real world, consumers make decisions based on imperfect information. Ideally, if people had all three of these aspects, it would be perfect or symmetrical information. And if they don't, which we don't, it's imperfect or asymmetrical information. All right, this second part of the rational consumer model is bounded rationality. And just to be clear, we're going to be approaching this word a lot, this word bounded, which is the assumption that here in all consumers have perfect rationality, okay? But in reality, we have bounded or limited. For people who don't know, bounded means limited. Rationality is basically just logic, okay? So if you ever heard something is irrational, that could be called as illogical. So the term bounded rationality is used to explain the notion that the rationality of consumers is limited by the information that they have. So it's just a continuation of the point before. However, this causes bounded rationality, okay? And the fact that they do not have the time nor the cognitive abilities to weigh up all the options. So basically, it's assuming that if even we had all the information and we knew what information we needed to make a certain economic decision, we do not have the logic or the time or the cognitive abilities or the energy to actually rationalize how much money would I save with product A compared to product B. Besides a very basic level of, oh, product A is $5, product B is $10. If there's any more information like product A is 50 grams and product B is 70 grams, we don't have time for the calculations. Hence, we have limited logic or we have limited abilities in considering all the information, whether it's imperfect or perfect, to weigh up all the options. Okay, and number 3, bounded selfishness. So limited selfishness, hard to say. In other words, consumers are assumed to act selfishly. Remember what we said before about best interests? Only taking their own objective of utility maximization into account when making choices. But in fact, what a surprise, some humans do care about others. Hence what I was talking about before with charity or boycotting brands that use child labor like Shein or boycotting Nutella because they're destroying the environment. So the term now, bounded selfishness, is used to explain that humans do not always act in their own self-interest as assumed by the neoclassical, or also just known as like the presumptuous model or basic model, let's say. But we'll introduce this term later on. And lastly, part 4, bounded or limited self-control. Finally, it is assumed that when acting rationally, even if we did have perfect information and perfect logic here, consumers would still be able to demonstrate perfect willpower. Once again, think about the examples I said before. Generic goods like sugary foods or cigarettes or alcohol are all things that in some way people might have addictions to. But in a perfect reality, consumers would have perfect willpower and would say, enough is enough, or I don't need that, or that's not good for me. But in reality, we have a limited or bounded self-control to illustrate the natural tendency to give in to temptations or addictions sometimes, okay? So even when you were on a diet and you said, I'm not going to eat ice cream because I want to lose fat, you still ate a little bit of ice cream because you gave in to that temptation. Hence, you had limited or bounded self-control. All right, moving on to something a little more abstract. We're going to be talking about something called a dual system model, which is once again just evaluating the psychology of how people think and specifically how consumers think when evaluating choices. Now, according to this model, individuals actually have 2 different systems of thinking, known as System 1, the fast thinking system, and System 2, the slow thinking system, which we'll look at more closely in the next few slides because they're actually really interesting to think about. But this model is used to explain why, that big question, humans don't think completely rationally in all aspects of considering demand. So now that we've listed all 4 of the assumptions of demand and all 4 reasons why these are assumptions and they're not realistic, we have to look at specifically why these assumptions are not feasible. So we'll be looking at the dual system model and the 2 systems that provoke it. All right, so we first start with System 1, which is the automatic thinking that's not a straight line, sorry, but it's the automatic thinking system. So as we have here in this little chart, it's basically different words that describe how our automatic choices are made by our brain, essentially. So some points. If you answer the question, what is 3 plus 4? Okay, if you said 6, If you said 8, you're not right. But if you said 7, then congratulations, you have automatic thinking and you're able to answer a question. And if you are able to say 7, then you know what that automatic thinking feels like, where as soon as somebody asks it, you just have it in your head immediately. Okay, another form of automatic thinking is when you get home from school on the route that you've taken every day for the last year. Sometimes we don't even need to pay attention to directions in our everyday lives if they're being repeated so consistently. Okay, so we have automatic thinking because we're already being taken there. We've already memorized it, and it's basically just part of our everyday life now. Okay, speaking in your mother tongue, which is a really funny way that they say to speak in your native language, or for people who are bilingual, or especially to people who are experiencing trying to adapt a second language like me. You realize how when you have to speak a language that you haven't grown up with, how hard you have to try. And then when you speak in your native language, for example, my native language is English, it's so easy, it's so automatic compared to me learning a new language. It's crazy. So this automatic thinking. Or also, the big one, doing grocery shopping, which is a great example of this. If you've been grocery shopping at the same place for the past 20 years, automatically you gravitate towards the same genre of products and the same brand of those genres of products, okay? It's automatic because you're used to it. It's a method or it's memorized. And any of these words or phrases right here will basically relate to any automatic thinking. So gut instinct, what do you really feel like is the right choice? Intuitive, effortless, impulsive, immediate, and any choice that is fast, okay? However, it can also be uncontrolled. If you just keep focusing on decisions that are so immediate and fast and just the first thing that comes into your head, it's not always a good thing, so it can be uncontrolled and messy at times. Okay, but automatic thinking is used to make quick economic decisions and choosing what products to consume. So let's say you're working at an office and you have 10 minutes to get lunch from McDonald's before your lunch break is over and you get back to the boss or else you'll be fired, okay? You have to really rely on making quick economic decisions using automatic thinking to do that. And let's say you go to McDonald's and there's 2 burgers, okay? There's one that's $5 and there's one that's $10. Again, automatic thinking, okay, we'll probably assume, well, what's the difference between $5 and $10? Oh, I can save $5 with a cheaper product. I'll choose that one. Automatic thinking is just looking at quick judgments of that product, such as the price, maybe the color, what does it say on the container, or just a gut instinct, like I feel like this product will save me more money than this product. Okay, so it's essentially just the process of our mind making assumptions. Now, obviously, if system 1 is all about automatic thinking and just the first choice that comes into our head, then system 2 is going to be the complete opposite of that. Okay, it's going to be something called reflective thinking. And if you take IB, oh my god, this word reflecting is so scary, but it's basically any decision that we make that takes careful consideration and is not decided by our automatic reaction. So for example, if I asked you, what is 1,989 times 31? You're gonna have to think about it, probably even use a calculator, but it's not just like an automatic, what is 1 times 2 type of thing, okay? When you choose your IB subjects, I love this example because you have to carefully consider, oh, how many higher levels do I need to take? Which ones are the hardest classes? Which ones do I need for college? X, Y, Z. You have to make so many mini and micro decisions in that big decision overall. Having a conversation in a second language in which you are not fluent. Basically what I said right before is that when you're talking in a language that you are fluent and that you grew up in, it's so automatic. You don't have to think about grammar, how you pronounce things, accent, or anything really. But when you're learning a new language and you try to speak in it, you have to think super carefully about tenses, about grammar, structure, how to pronounce the words right, X, Y, Z. Now, these words can basically represent reflective thinking. It's controlled, it's calculating, deliberate, logical, really important. It's more logical when we think about something over a longer period of time. However, it is slow, and the decisions are typically unemotional because you're considering it from a logical perspective. Okay, and reflective thinking is going to be used to evaluate economic decisions and choosing what products to consume. Okay, so both together, how realistic are these systems? Well, when people have important and complex decisions to make, they usually use elements of the reflective system and take their time to make a decision because reflective is going to be the slow system. So when you have more time to make a decision, you're going to make it slowly, consider everything possible. Whereas automatic system can take over, and this can result in poor decision making. So it's less logical and it's much faster. That's usually why we use it, okay? And while typically we use a combination of these systems to complete everyday tasks, sometimes they do overlap, and sometimes we consider something, for example, buying a product. We think about it both for a second, what's my gut feeling, and then also evaluate it just a little bit, thinking, hey, do I really need this? Let's compare the quantities. Let's compare how much the price is paying for the quantity that I'm getting, X, Y, Z, and just so much more. And so when we're considering behavioral economics, we have to consider that while reflective thinking is much better in the long term, most people don't use this when making quick economic decisions, especially for smaller things like food or maybe clothes even. But when you're considering things like buying a car or buying a house, obviously people use reflective thinking because they have more time to prepare for that. But if you're just randomly being asked, hey, what type of McDonald's burger do you want? We're going to be using our automatic thinking system most of the time. All right, so now let's talk about something called heuristics, which is something taken straight out of psychology. So what is heuristics? Well, I'm going to start down here, actually. A heuristic may be defined as a mental shortcut that allows people to make decisions and solve problems quickly and efficiently. Okay, some examples of this is how on a day-to-day basis, we make thousands of decisions, most of them we don't even realize, and have to cope with a tremendous amount of information. So in order to make these heuristic decisions quickly, we employ certain rules of thumb. So rules of thumb could be anything like, if you go to the grocery store, I have a rule of thumb that I don't buy anything with over 20 grams of sugar. That's a rule of thumb, so I can immediately cut out some options for peanut butter. If we're bringing that back again, if we're looking at peanut butter, I automatically cut out some options for me to choose between because they have too much sugar. Or maybe you say, I only buy ice cream on Friday nights to prepare for Saturday. I don't buy on any other day of the week, so I'm just going to take that out of my grocery cart altogether. Okay, it's a mental shortcut that we can easily just relate to help us with decision making. However, there are something called cognitive biases, which you're going to be looking at, implicit in the shortcuts we employ that may be problematic and result in poor decisions. So obviously the rules of thumbs that we each have, which are super individual to us, are going to be dictated by our cognitive thinking or cognitive biases. However, if those biases are off or illogical or kind of hurt us in some way rather than help us, they may be problematic and actually help with poor decision making instead of good decision making. Okay, and just to be clear, these are both terms, a heuristic and cognitive bias, that refer to both psychology and economics. Okay, that's why we're overlapping between these two right now. Okay, so now we're going to expand on cognitive biases, continuation of psychology. So psychologists have identified many biases that affect consumer choices. Behavioral economics uses the understanding of these biases to help consumers make better choices. So by definition, cognitive biases are a series of biases or opinions that all humans have that give perfectly rational consumer choices, okay? We're going to be looking at all the biases here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. We're going to be looking at 7 biases here. That's a lot. And these are some biases that, as we'll explain and expand on later on, all affect our thinking in some way, whether we realize it or not, okay? And actually, I have gotten a question on a past IB paper that asked me to list all 7 biases. So I remember it using acronyms because that's my easiest way to remember things. Flash. So we have availability, hurting, framing, loss aversion, anchoring, status quo or Ineria, and hyperbolic, discounting, to recall all of these terms. Let's list everything again, because I guess that's the theme of what we're doing today. Number 1 is availability bias. Okay, so it turns out that consumers are actually quite poor at assessing risk and probabilities, relying on recent examples rather than carefully examined data. Okay, remember, this is all a problem with the automatic system 1 thinking, okay? That's what happens when we think too fast sometimes. We just think about what most recently happened instead of continuous data over time. Okay, so the availability of recent information and examples tends to over-influence people's decision-making. For example, I've listed a few examples for each of these, so let's break them down. If you are considering buying cigarettes, and let's say recently on the way to the store, you passed by a few 80-year-olds smoking cigarettes, okay? Now, realistically, most people who smoke actually get lung cancer and don't live as long as 80, and that might actually influence your decision to not smoke because you think it's hurting your body or health, which it is. However, if you most recently saw older people smoke, that might make you think, well, they don't look like they're sick, and I don't think that smoking has affected them, so maybe I'll buy some cigarettes too. Okay, so I'm actually going to use an example for the states for this one. So for example, when Biden became president, he took over a bunch of responsibilities in the USA for COVID-19 and how to handle that international pandemic. Let's say it's now 2024 and he's running for president again, and you're considering the decisions that he has made in the past to influence the USA if you're a citizen there, okay? You might think most recently, let's say you reread a recent article that talked about COVID-19 4 years ago, okay? That would remind you, hey, if I think Biden did an awful job handling COVID-19, even if he's done a bunch of other great things, the recent information and reminder that he did an awful job handling this is going to make me not vote for him, okay? And I added this last one because I recently saw Titanic. Now, if you recently saw something like Titanic, or you heard a story about a boat sinking or a plane crashing or some other awful disaster during travel, that might affect how you travel, okay? I'm sure you don't want to hop on a cruise right after watching Titanic, or that you want to hop right on an airplane as soon as you hear about Amelia Earhart just disappearing, okay? So recent information, as we can see from these examples, can affect us whether we're aware of it or not, can affect how we perceive, for example, the dangers of something, or how we evaluate the risks of something. Number 2, anchoring bias is when we are given the value of something and then use this value as a reference point to influence future choices or decisions. Salespeople use this when prices are negotiable by offering a very high starting price and then accepting a lower price that is still higher than what the product should cost. So this is really interesting, okay? So there are some thrifting places, which is the first thing that comes to mind for me. But for example, there are some thrifting places whereby salespeople give you a price and they expect you to negotiate it lower down so it benefits you the most, okay? Okay, so like let's say for example, right, there's a t-shirt that is $40 brand new, okay? So at the thrift store, they might say, I'm gonna charge you $40 for it. And then you decrease that down to $20, okay? And let's say realistically it's worth $5. $20, which they accept because they're like, okay, it's 20 less, but it's still 20 because the producers know it's actually worth $5. So you think you're actually getting a steal because you cut this price in half. Whereas in reality, the producers are kind of stealing you because you still overpaid quite a bit, $15. You overpaid by $15 to get that price. So that's why a bunch of salespeople, you'll see them start with a stupid high price just because they expect you to anchor onto that price and compare it to every other price. Because if they started with $20, then you would not want to offer to pay $20. You'd want to get it lower than that. So as you can see, people can argue or negotiate down prices based on how expensive that price initially was or how expensive that anchoring price was. So most of the examples of anchoring biases are in terms of salespeople, specifically clothing stores I'm thinking of. So another really kind of scummy thing that people do is that even if there isn't a sale, people might take this $40 t-shirt and say, oh, before it was $40, but now it's on sale for $30. So you'll look at that and you'll be like, wow, I'm saving $10 whole. Okay, that's what consumers think. And so they're anchoring onto that previous price and they're thinking, I'm saving. Whereas in reality, a bunch of producers actually make products that are originally this price, but then they create tags that say that the original price is the sale price and then increase the original price to make people anchor onto that higher price and hence make more money. It's really scummy, but it does happen. And another quick example is how people will usually put higher priced items in front of lower priced items, maybe in grocery stores. So let's use that for the example, okay? They might put 5 expensive jars of pickles, let's say, next to 5 cheaper jars of pickles, and then you choose a cheaper jar. And you think it's a steal because you compare it to the expensive jar. But if there was no expensive jar to compare it to, you would think that the cheaper one is still expensive. So this is all really based on the idea that we are comparing what we're willing to pay for something compared to how other people, specifically producers, have valued that product, even if it's not true. Okay, framing bias, number 3. So the way that information is presented to us influences our choices, the way. And in many cases, especially where data is presented, a given piece of information may be presented in either a positive or a negative way. So although the product would be identical, the framing of information includes a cognitive bias. So let's take a look at a few examples. Okay, nutrition labels are actually really interesting to me. And since I'm an IB, I actually take standard level biology, okay? And for people who are looking at health nutrition labels, there is actually something that you might have heard of before called trans fat. And I learned this from bio. But basically, it's the most unhealthy fat you could ever get or eat. It's really bad for you. And people have started to associate this term trans fat on a food label really badly because that affects them probably not buying it because it's so unhealthy. So if you're aware, I learned this in bio, but if you ever see the phrase partly hydrogenized, it's just another way that it's being marketed to not explicitly say that there's trans fat in something, okay? So that's actually really interesting because if you go and you see a donut that says trans fat, you're more likely to think, not for me. If you see partly hydrogenized, then this information is framed in, well, a technically correct way. These mean the same thing, but most people don't know the second term, okay? So the way that they framed it in turning this casual term into a more scientific one basically makes people unaware of the fact that they mean the same thing. Hence, people will buy that donut if it says partially hydrogenized because there's nothing on it explicitly saying that it is unhealthy, okay? Sales pitches, and so many sales pitches, do we see people frame information to feel like a steal? For example, buy one, get one free is a super example. You'll think, I'm buying one and I'm getting one free, that's amazing. Okay, and another one of my favorites is pricing products at the number 99 is at X dollars with 99 cents, which especially in the States, I see all the time something that's listed, oh, it's 99 cents or it's 98 cents, or sometimes it's even like something random like 57, okay? So let's say it's $1, okay? That's most often. The way that they frame it is there's only 1 cent difference between $1.99 and $2. And even if a store is selling something at $1.99 instead of $2, they're only losing 1 penny to it, okay? So they're willing to risk that 1 penny to market things that say 1 point something or to make it look like it's less than 2, okay? Because most people will take into account the first column. So would you rather pay $1 than $2? And then look here, okay? But a lot of people actually just briefly read the first column and then the second one. And if you have something that's $1.99 compared to something that's $2, $2 does look more expensive because in the first column, it's 2, which is 1 more than 1. And also right here is a really interesting example too, because you think that this is super close to 150. And it looks close enough that you don't really mind that it's a little bit over 150. However, the store is framing it that they're actually cheating you out of another extra 7 cents just because they're preying on the idea that you think it looks like 150. So that's why, for example, you see a lot of things have these either really specific odd numbers or end with 99 or 98 instead of a round whole dollar. Social conformity, herd behavior, we've already talked about this earlier today, but as consumers, we naturally want to fit in. The way that others behave can exert a powerful influence on our own choices. This is also known as the bandwagon effect, I'm sure you've heard of this before, and is used to describe the behavior of people when they join a perceived majority of people in doing something, even if it is against their best interest. So before we look at the examples, I want to look at this. Of people when they join a perceived majority. Let's say you live in a town where, I'm going to be looking at vapes here. So let's say you live in a town where 90% of the population vapes. You think that the majority of people vape. But as soon as you leave the town, you realize that less than 0.1% of the population actually vapes. So remember, this whole herd behavior perception is based on how they perceive the majority. Okay, so I'll put quotes around that even. How do you perceive the majority? Okay. For example, if you're following herd behavior in your school, the majority of a population is based on the students at that school, not the majority of the population in the whole society, okay? So examples, changes in fashion trends. People want to follow fashion trends because they're popular and they think that people will compliment them more and it's just fashionable at that time, okay? I used the example of slime. In 2017, every single child in the world played with slime. And everybody did it and it became a trend. If you weren't making, playing with, or selling slime, you were not in the perceived majority, okay? You were kind of missing out. And so to get on that bandwagon of everybody being cool and making slime, everybody else made slime. Okay, and this last one is probably the most common example, which is vapes and smoking in general, I think it is. But it's basically like this kind of peer pressure effect, which we talked about before, which is basically if you think everybody is vaping or everybody who is vaping is cool, then you're more likely to want to do it because you want to fit in and you want to join this majority of people and not be an outcast or whatever, even if it is against your best interest. Let's say you don't like vaping. Let's say you want to take care of your health. Let's say you think it's cringe or whatever it might be. You might not like it, but because of this huge idea that you want to fit in, you are willing to sacrifice your health or your own pride just to fit in with other people. Okay, number 5, status quo or inertia bias. It is often the case that consumers faced with a set of choices would prefer to maintain the status quo, also known as the absence of change, by doing nothing. Okay, it is quite likely that consumer would prefer to just stick with the same provider, even if something else might actually provide more utility. Okay, so there's many reasons why, if we are so used to making decisions or choosing options that we have just made a pattern out of in terms of system 1 thinking, that this relates to is we're just used to making the same choices. We just probably won't change it because we want to follow the status quo. We want to follow what's normal for us, okay? So some examples of this would include Apple phones, okay? Over the years, more people have stopped buying Apple phones, I would say. And for example, there are people that don't buy Apple phones anymore, and that switched to Samsung phones now. But if you're somebody who's bought like 7 Apple phones over the past 2 years, then you know what it's like to just be like, oh, I have to get a new phone. Immediately, I'm using my system 1 thinking, and it's gonna be from Apple. Whereas, in my opinion at least, Apple phones really aren't that good. And because you're making this choice of sticking with status quo, something else might actually provide more utility. There are much better phones out there, but because you're sticking with the same decision because it's comfortable or familiar, you're not going to be making a good decision for yourself in the long run, okay? Another example right here is drinking Starbucks every morning. So I have had so many people in my lives tell me that they become broke from buying like $6, $7 drinks at Starbucks every morning. And I mean, yeah, of course. But if you're drinking Starbucks every morning and you get used to it and you don't really want to change it, you'll realize that you can get the same product for cheaper at a grocery store just by making it at home maybe, or maybe just going to a local coffee shop instead of the one of such a big international company. Number 6, okay, loss aversion bias. Experiments show that humans feel that losses are far more significant than gains. It has been estimated that the pain that people feel from losing something is about twice as powerful as the pleasure that they get from gaining something. Okay, this is linked to the status quo bias, so the reluctance to change, as consumers may be reluctant to change the status quo due to the fear of loss. So basically what happens here is, I think the experiment that they were talking about in the textbook was related to a time in like not Jeopardy, but in one of those like game shows where you earn money. Let's say you have $50, okay? If I tell you you're going to be getting $50, but then I say you're going to be losing $10, it doesn't matter that $10 is less than 50. This is a way bigger burst to your ego than this, because humans just naturally want to have an aversion to loss. We want to completely decimate the possibility of losing stuff. Because as it says right here, the pain that we have from losing something, even if it is not that significant compared to what we do have, is about twice as powerful as the pleasure we get from gaining something. Okay, and some companies do prey on this. For example, marketing techniques, and I'm gonna connect these two, marketing techniques and not buying lottery tickets. So what is the chance of winning a lottery? I actually don't know. Let's say it's for 1.5 million, okay? And in reality, let's say you bought one ticket and you got nothing, okay? Well, some people aren't happy with that because they lost $5 even though the potential gain was 1.5 million. And that's why there are some people in the world who buy every single lottery ticket possible for some lotteries, and they might spend 5 million on lottery tickets just to get back 1.5 million, just because they were so adverse to the idea that they could lose $5 per ticket that they tried to avoid it at every cost, even though in the end they lost more money. In this moment, this part, the $5 ticket, is what they were trying to adversely not lose. Number 7, hyperbolic discounting. And really quickly, for anybody who doesn't know, hyperbolic is also known as something that's dramatic if you take English classes. So dramatic discounting. It refers to the tendency of humans to prefer smaller, short-time rewards over larger, later rewards. So this is based on the preference that we want something in the present versus in the future. This cognitive bias is even more powerful when the reward is much further in the future. Okay, for example, starting homework late. Okay, so many people start homework late because they're like, oh, I could do it later because I don't have to do it now. So I'm discounting the effect that this is going to have on my future because at the moment, I don't really care about my future. I don't care as much about it as I do about the present. And in the present, I want to watch Gilmore Girls. I don't know, okay? And so I'm not going to do homework now, and I'm going to care about the present instead, okay? Investing in stocks. A lot of people don't want to invest in stocks or are reluctant to because if you spend $5 for a stock and in the future you might get $50 from that stock, let's say in 2 years, which is a longer period of time than homework will take, a lot of people will say, yeah, I can get that later, but I really want to use it now just because the idea of having money in the present is so much more enticing because we can use it now. We don't have to wait. We don't have a limit. Okay, so that's actually a common possibility. And then also smoking, bringing that up again. This is like the third time I brought it up in terms of biases, but it's a really good example. So smoking, people will smoke when they're 24 and because they don't have any health problems yet or because they haven't started aging rapidly or facing the repercussions of smoking too much, they might continue to smoke because the bad or negative side effects, such as health effects of smoking, aren't going to be prominent until the future. So until those happen, people will continue to smoke. So everything that we just looked at was an example of behavioral economics. But why is behavioral economics so important? Well, given the many cognitive biases which cause consumers to make poor choices, sometimes using their System 1 automatic thinking system, behavioral economists, which is a specific area of economics, by the way, aims to help consumers make better choices. So essentially, it's the idea that overall, economists want to help people make perfect choices and help people become economists in the sense that they perfectly fit the rational consumer model so that they can better choices for themselves and they can better choices for producers and other agents in the economy as well. Okay, but now we're going to be looking at something called choice architecture, which is something that behavioral economists study to help influence them to decide how to structure products that are sold in an economy. So choice architecture here is the theory that the decisions that we make are heavily influenced by the ways in which the choices are presented to us. For example, a bunch of the examples of the cognitive biases help shape choice architecture. And just to be clear, choice architecture is mostly physical. So think about architecture like a layout in a grocery store is a very common example of how behavioral economists work to structure it because the choices that you make in the architecture there influence how consumers or what consumers buy. Okay, so some specific examples, all in grocery stores, is candy in the checkout aisle. So when you're buying food and you're in the checkout aisle, they have little snacks, little candy bars, little mints for you to buy. And that's because when you're waiting for the person to check you out, you might just be a little bit bored. You might look around and you might see some gum or some candy and think, oh, I kind of want a little treat. And so you're more likely to take it because it just seems like a small little snack that you can add on top. Okay. Another example is that a lot of people actually choose, if they're choosing between, let's say they're choosing steaks, a lot of people would just pick up the first one, maybe check the expiration date, but then move on. And that's because a lot of people are lazy and grocery stores absolutely take advantage of that. So they place the most expensive or the closest to expiring steaks at the front so that more people will grab those. And then at the back, maybe you have to even reach back to find it, are the cheaper ones or the ones that will last longer, okay? And then this last one is really interesting to me. It's basically where on the lower shelves, especially if you're in the grocery stores where from lower to higher shelf is just completely stacked with food, you'll see that they have the sweet food or the food that has like Disney characters, Cartoon Network characters on it, or other stuff like that, or food in general that is marketed to kids will be placed on lower shelves because choice architects take the average height of kids in those demographics, maybe that's on like the second or third lowest shelf, and then kids, when they look straight forward, the first thing in their face is that like Lucky Charms cereal with a picture of Cinderella on it or whatever, and they'll want that, and then parents will buy it for them, compared to if the kids' products were on the adults' level, the kids are less likely to see it and the adults won't naturally be reaching for it. And whether choice architecture actually has an influence in our lives, you can actually tell that choice architecture is present when it changes a default or system one decision, okay? And that's because if we're choosing this example here, let's say naturally I have my rule of thumb, I have my heuristic, my shortcut that says I don't want to buy candy this week because I'm on a diet. If I go to the checkout counter and then I say, you know what, I'll get some candy because I want a little treat, and then I leave the grocery store, I'll realize choice architecture did influence what I bought because I wasn't planning or wanting to buy candy. However, I did because of where it was and how I saw it. And aside choice architecture is the difference between two choices that consumers make. There's default choices and there's mandated choices. So let's start with default. An example of an area where choice architecture can be served is when a default choice is changed. So a default is just the regular choice that you would make. However, choice architecture might influence this and even change it. So an example of a default choice is one that is preset option that is effectively selected if the decision maker does nothing. So basically what is present in that and what will happen if you don't actively try to change anything. Okay, and then the second choice, which we'll look at on the next slide, is a choice that is always followed unless a deliberate decision is made to change it. But we'll look at that on the next slide. But some examples of default choice is the automatic Google search engine. So when you open up Chrome, because Google and Chrome kind of go hand in hand, we don't necessarily usually look up other alternatives to search engines like Bing or Yahoo, because Google, if it's already there, we're just going to use it, okay? We're not going to actively seek out another search engine, or it will be less likely that we do so. Okay, or if we have a habit like buying an espresso from Starbucks every morning, if we don't actively decide, no, I want to stop doing that, then we're probably going to keep doing it. Okay, it's a default choice and default action. However, this last one is the most interesting to me because specifically in Canada is where I heard this happen. But basically, because hospitals were running out of organ donations, because over time less people have started to donate their organs, they've basically flipped what choice of donating organs is default. So basically now in Canada, you are automatically, or by default, you are an organ donor unless you actively say, I don't want to donate organs. And that's because a lot of people, they go with the default. So if the government frames it that by default you are donating organs compared to by default you aren't donating them, then more people are likely to donate organs because in general, less people change default choices. And in contrast, we have mandated choice, which is the complete opposite, which is how choice architects can influence customers through mandated choice, which are situations where people are required by law to make a choice in advance. Once again, let's continue with this organ donation thing. So mandated choice is the opposite of default choice because you're using an action to change that choice. So let's say in Canada, let's say you're automatically put up to be an organ donor, but you don't want to be, okay? So then you have to basically go to the government and say, hey, I don't want to donate my organs. So now it becomes a mandated choice that you're choosing to not donate your organs, okay? Another example is wills, okay? When you die, who gets your property? Who gets your textbooks? Who gets your cats, okay? You have to make decisions which are required by law and which, if you do write it, will get rid of the default options if you suddenly die. So I don't really know it specifically in any country per se, but I'm pretty sure when you die, if you don't write a will, it just immediately goes to your family. But let's say you want to donate all your money to a cat charity. Well, then you have to make the mandated choice to write your will in that certain way. Okay, and this last one is voting. Okay, so if you're over 18, at least in the States, you have to make a choice in advance about who you're going to vote for. Republican versus Democrat is the most common scenario. But by default, if you just happen to not vote, you are put on a register as an 18-year-old or older who just never voted. So when you do actually vote for a side, you're making a mandated choice because you are choosing action to fulfill a certain choice. Okay, and the last concept we're going to be looking at today is something called nudge theory, the last part of behavioral economics here. And this is the theory that suggests that the choice architecture, such as in a grocery store, offered to people can be carefully designed to gently encourage or nudge people to voluntarily choose the option which is better for them. So as we saw on one of the few previous slides, there are many subtle examples of choice architecture in grocery stores. And the intentions behind choice architecture in these scenarios is basically to nudge people to make choices that the company or the grocery store wants them to make. Automatically, we can assume to make the most revenue for them as possible. Okay, and the key to nudge theory is that consumers maintain their consumer sovereignty, also known as their right to choose, but are encouraged to make better decisions. So basically, the intention behind choice architecture is while they would like to encourage or nudge people to make certain choices, they're doing that through the system one way of thinking. Like automatically, if I am a child and I see Lucky Charms cereal with Cinderella on it, I immediately want to grab it because I associate, like, for example, Disney characters with good things, okay? So that's an example of how choice architecture can influence system one. However, the point of nudge theory is to be so subtle that it doesn't influence our system two way of thinking, our super reflective evaluative way of thinking of, I don't know if I actually want that. So this nudge theory is just kind of shown to be the intention behind choice architecture, but also to prove that choice architecture is supposed to be intrusive enough that it influences, but non-intrusive enough that it doesn't make decisions directly for us, okay? And just in case you want another common example, is placing a food in a cafeteria. That's why in some places, if you walk into a cafeteria, the easiest to reach food might be salads or fruits or something healthy. That's because if somebody's really hungry, they're more likely to grab the first food they see, which is something healthier. And schools, and especially school communities, might want to encourage people to eat healthier. So they might make a decision like this so that people are more likely to eat healthy foods before unhealthy foods. Okay, and like I explained before, nudge theory is especially important for fixing, this is subjective, but fixing people's system one ways of thinking. So basically, it's if the grocery store really wants to increase their revenue and they want to fix your automatic way of thinking, I don't want to get extra candy today, they think that's a problem because that's not getting them as much money as they want. So then they might put the candy at the cash register and they're fixing, put that in quotes, they're fixing your system one way of thinking. However, it can also be used to reverse the effect of some cognitive biases, also by means of quote-unquote fixing, like hyperbolic discounting. And while we're just using the big example of this in grocery stores, nudge theory has actually contributed to improvements in people's standards of living, their health, their communities, and the environment. So while standards of living might relate to producers or people who own grocery stores, they're not the only people who use nudge theory. Healthcare facilities use nudge theory to convince you to get healthcare and improves social health overall. Communities and charities do the same thing, and so do organizations that are there to try to help the environment. They all use nudge theory in a certain way to help their cause. Okay, and while improvements, let me underline that, is once again, like fixing, kind of subjective, we typically assume that the improvements refer to the economic goal of well-being, the economic concept, rather than profit. Okay, now when we're looking at this bigger picture, we're assuming that the economy and society in general is here to fix itself and to help improve itself with nudge theory to the extent that it's making the community better as a whole, and it's not necessarily completely motivated by money. And that will do it for today for standard level and higher level of demand, chapter 2.2 in IB Economics.